Thanks for coming on, Keith. Welcome back. Third episode. So I think this is going to be the Keith Littlewood show from now on.
Is it the third one?
Third one, yeah.
Oh wow.
We did we did a general digestion one. Then we did sugar.
Okay, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yes.
So today we're going to do serotonin, which should be interesting. Yes. So just to get straight to it, what exactly is serotonin, just so that we've got a base to work from?
Well, I'll tell you what serotonin isn't, I guess, to start, because a lot of people misconstrue serotonin as this happy hormone. Well, it's really not a hormone at all. I mean, it's technically a what's called a biogenic amine, or it's really a neurotransmitter. And everyone kind of waxes lyrical. You see a lot of nutritionists who say, yeah, you need to eat lots of serotonin-rich foods, and that can be very problematic. But I think serotonin's primary role that people generally know about it is it's a neurotransmitter, and it's primarily produced in the digestive tract. It's actually produced in the enterochromaffin cells in the gut. And you'll find about somewhere between 95 to 97% of the body's serotonin there, with a very smaller amount being found in the brain. And there are many problems that tend to arise from having an excess of serotonin, despite the common medical theme that mood-related issues tend to come from a depletion of serotonin. So I think it's commonly known that serotonin is a problem, but I think people are often not sure about where the problem from serotonin comes from.
Okay, so you mentioned, it's commonly considered the happy hormone, but then you mentioned there that it is acknowledged that there are downsides to it. So where did that happy hormone label come from, and why does it still persist?
Well, I think I'll always kind of draw back on the work of Ray Peat. He's written a couple of good articles on his website, raypeat.com, where you can look at, there's a couple of articles. One is on brain aggression and brain energy. And the other one is on kind of serotonin and its processes in the inflammatory state. And I think the concept of the happy hormone came from the older research, where they were trying to use the first generation serotonin drugs, which looking at them and looking back may not have actually affected serotonin at all. But the newer generation of serotonin drugs, or serotonin reuptake inhibitors, may play a part in increasing the amount of the serotonin that's available, and in some people may actually kind of increase states of kind of helplessness and just general downregulation. It depends on the person and what's going on to a degree. But I think the initial research was coming out decades ago, and what's quite interesting is that LSD is an antagonist of serotonin, and where LSD is known to increase playfulness, certainly at the right level, and explorative behavior, serotonin tends to be the opposite. In some people, it tends to drive aggressive-like states. In some people, it creates helpless-type states, and it's certainly associated with learned helplessness. And part of that plays into the energetic concept of what serotonin does, which is really down-regulating kind of efficient metabolism. So I think, again, Pete talks about how LSD, there was a lot of kind of negative press put out about LSD. I think in the 60s, when it was quite well known and was used in many kind of drug circles or partying circles, or used in many different arenas. I know the military were experimenting with it for years, and I think you can even, if you hunt it down on YouTube, there's a couple of videos of soldiers who were exposed to excess amounts of LSD, who were kind of losing the ability to fight and just wandering off and playing in nature, which seems quite interesting. Maybe there's a lot of soldiers that could be used to taking that.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, that's where I think the original kind of the misconception of serotonin as a happy hormone. And again, it's not a hormone as such. It's kind of really involved in neurotransmission and signaling. And I think the some of the broader applications, and where again there are other areas where people kind of get mistaken about the role of serotonin, is particularly in its role in sleep. I'm not sure how much you've kind of been exposed to about the role of serotonin in sleep, but again, you'll see a lot of integrative practitioners. You'll see a lot of people who recommend the use of kind of 5-HTP. And so basic physiology is that serotonin is converted from tryptophan, which is a very common amino acid that's found in muscle meats and meats as such, and can be found in other sources as well. But intestinal serotonin is produced primarily in the intestinal tract, as I alluded to earlier on. But sometimes when we're eating high amounts of muscle meats, this can drive the amounts of tryptophan, which can convert to serotonin. And this kind of gets back to our kind of subject on sleep, is that if you have too much serotonin, it can actually keep you awake. But a lot of people tend to focus on a small role of serotonin in its kind of sleep-wake aspect. So, for example, serotonin does have a small inhibitory role on the cholinergic area of the brain that's used for kind of responsiveness and wakefulness and thought processing. But it's actually, I think that there are many other factors that are involved in pushing you into getting to sleep, such as adenosine. And adenosine is used to making you sleepy. But serotonin has actually been well validated as a neurotransmitter of wakefulness. It kind of takes you out of that REM, that rapid eye movement phase of sleep. It wakes you up. It synergizes with histamine, and it's no surprise that when the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, one of the key side effects of those drugs was actually insomnia. But everyone still makes the association of taking things like St. John's wort, 5-HTP, tryptophan-rich foods. But again, it's like anything in a fine balance as such. Is if you don't have that fine balance, and particularly if you have too much serotonin, which may come from intestinal inflammation as well, then that might be the very reason why you're either having a hard time getting to sleep, have a hard time staying asleep, and also kind of what it's going to do throughout the rest of the day. So if anything, I think serotonin could be described as an unhappy compound rather than a happy compound.
Okay. And so you mentioned those downsides and that it's associated with increased aggression, that sort of thing, learned helplessness. And so that's an uncontroversial position or a statement, is it? Like in the medical community, in the research, like for anyone who's familiar with the research, if you were to say that.
I think this is where some of the problem arise from. Now, I'm not an expert in SSRIs. A lot of my kind of motivation for some of the learning has been looking at what serotonin does, and serotonin, it kind of, because it synergizes with things like histamine, you can trace it back to inflammatory states within the body, and everyone assumes that what a selective reuptake drug is doing is just increasing the amount of serotonin available, and that's true, but it doesn't get degraded as much. Usually serotonin is degraded by the monoamine oxidase, which helps to degrade serotonin. And some of the problems that arise when you have too much serotonin can be systemic, because it can have the reaction. There are certain animal experiments where they injected horses with serotonin, and it made them very aggressive and very angry and irritable. And this is certainly something that I can see with clients that I often suspect of having too much serotonin production, which you can see in states like flushing. You can certainly see it in mood states, and the whole concept of kind of, a biological downgrade, as it were, which kind of relates to kind of like thyroid and metabolism, can be synergistic with the high estrogen, high serotonin, sometimes high histamine states that we see. So you have to look at, I think what you have to do is go away and extract yourself from the research that's out there on kind of depression and mood, and look at some of the biological implications of what serotonin does. And that's not always looked at. And to a degree, there's a large area of the research where they still don't know 100% why SSRIs work. And one of the theories might even be that what it's doing is, because there's a lot more serotonin, it might even increase the the rate in which some people remove serotonin from the system. But that's controversial, because some people say that it's actually being kept around a lot longer. But you can, I think, like I said, because if you're, I guess, that somebody who's prescribing those kind of drugs, you're just so concerned, or you probably only looked at the research that looks at the efficacy of SSRIs. And in some cases, there are some significant side effects that people have to go through before this so-called beneficial effect that might be happening, because there's a lot of negative effects associated with the gastrointestinal tract. This might kind of throw some of the problems that are associated with an excess of serotonin. And bearing in mind, if that 1% of serotonin that we're looking at within the brain, well, if there's a lot more serotonin around, we're certainly going to see negative side effects, like I said, in the bowel, because serotonin excess can be traced for a number of things related to the GI tract. I'll take let's say you've eaten something really bad that's not going to do you many favors. One of the roles of serotonin, which you can kind of look at within IBS states as well, is to kind of contract the small bowel and then evacuate the large bowel. So there's a synergy between serotonin and what it actually does to create function within the digestive tract. There's probably a book that quite a lot of people have heard of, which is it's The Second Brain. Have you heard of that book?
Yeah.
Which is about gut function and how serotonin is an instrumental part of digestive function. And they talk about some of the issues associated with SSRIs. And even the doctor in that book says, well, SSRIs are clearly a wonderful thing. They do a lot of good. And there are some people who do maybe have some kind of changes with that. But there are a lot of people who, I don't think you're actually getting to the key issue of what having too much serotonin does within the body. And there's a lot of inflammatory states. There's a lot of neurological damage that can occur from having too much serotonin around. And I think that's a real problem.
Okay. And so you mentioned that, what was I going to say? Obviously, it's a balance with serotonin, with anything. So
yeah.
There's a point at which it's useful, at which it's necessary, but people tend to have too much and that's why it's an issue? Or would you say that it's generally something that we don't really need or has no significant use to the body?
Well, like I said, we kind of look at there's most of the things in the body that are there for a reason, but there's certainly parallels with some compounds, and serotonin and estrogen synergize, and we know that estrogen within biology is problematic when it's in excess. We know it's linked to plenty of reproductive cancers. We know that an excess of estrogen increases cell proliferation and mitosis. And if there's not enough of the protective compounds, that can be a problem. And that's the same with serotonin, because they do synergize. And if you look at serotonin, I mean, what's quite interesting is that the original work that was completed on sleep-wake physiology, there were some big statements made, because what they found is when they removed the gene for serotonin production within the body, that mice just couldn't sleep. So the assumption was made that serotonin was necessary for entering sleep. But now they know, based upon the research, is that it wasn't that serotonin was instrumental in sleep. It's just that serotonin and melatonin are instrumental because they lower the body temperature and set the scene for increased sleep. So you need a bit of serotonin available, you need a bit of melatonin available, but at the same time, if you have too much or too little of them, they are going to create many problems. Now, this is getting into a kind of a wider conversation about sleep biology. But if we just kind of bring it back and look at serotonin, is that when you have somebody who's producing a lot of inflammation within the bowel, you're going to have an excess of serotonin. You can see a lot of negative symptoms related to the digestive tract, to mood. And I think that certainly we need a certain amount of serotonin, as in you need a certain amount of estrogen. There are many things that in the environment that are stimulating the excesses of estrogen. We know that xenoestrogens are kind of ubiquitous in the environment, and this is posing problems as well, because environmental stimulus will promote kind of more problems with excessive estrogen and excesses of serotonin, and hence excesses of cortisol. So there are many things that kind of get kicked up the butt to start being produced more.
Yeah, so you were talking about environmental influences of estrogen, serotonin, and those considerations. So do you want to just go from there?
Yeah, sure. So when you see a lot of environmental stimulus, say whether it's stress, whether it's pollutants, xenoestrogens, which will influence kind of the impact of estrogens throughout the body, you'll see an excess of serotonin, you'll see an excess of cortisol, and these is where problems really start to occur. So going back to whether serotonin is important, yes, it is important, but it is important at a certain level. And there are a few compounds where excesses of them seem to cause problems. It's not like we have many protective compounds such as thyroid or progesterone, testosterone, and these are very important, and they kind of create direction and what's the word I'm looking for? Organization of tissue, whereas estrogen, serotonin may be very problematic when they start to creep out of their optimal range. It's hard to perhaps identify what that optimal range is, but I think if you look at broader symptoms and other aspects of biology, you can make some assumptions based upon those. You don't always have to rely on lab testing and things like that.
Okay, and so this is all anecdotal, but I see a lot of people who either follow diets that are going to increase serotonin or take supplements that specifically aim to increase serotonin, and they'll always say great things, and people are trying nootropics, that sort of thing, trying 5-HTP, tryptophan, St. John's wort, that sort of thing, and people are very much recently into the idea of improving your cognition, improving your mood, and improving all of that. And so those who are seeing benefits, would that suggest that they're getting it just right, they're getting just that right amount of serotonin for them, or would you say that it's quite likely that what they're feeling is perhaps increased adrenaline and cortisol, which gives a good sensation for a short period, and eventually it's going to catch up to them, and they're going to eventually feel the detriments of excess serotonin?
Well, it's really hard to kind of pull out the cause and effect from that, because usually they're doing a number of things on top of that.
Yeah.
Nobody's usually taking a St. John's wort or a 5-HTP. I mean, if you're using other neurotropics, and the diet is going to be extremely important with that. But I mean, I use the term anecdotally as well, but I've seen a number of people who, and I'm talking hundreds of people who I've worked with, where there have been mood states, sleep states, and energetic states, that part of that has been driven by the intestinal inflammation. And so I use two aspects for looking at sleep, for example. And if you have trouble getting to sleep or waking up, I think it's either usually a blood sugar regulation issue or it's an intestinal inflammation issue. And I've seen a number of those things that when we start to get people eating right and remove the digestional inflammation kind of factors, that these have often resolved. And when you do look at things like serotonin, because it's been well documented as a compound of wakefulness, you have to kind of look at what they're experiencing over a broader aspect of time. So I've always kind of used the analogy of, or not the analogy, but the zone of dogma creation, is people start things, and within a short space of time, you may see some very positive things. And there's a window where everything seems optimal. It's a bit like going on a low carb diet, right? You get great weight loss, the energy's there, you're running off adrenaline, but then kind of 2 or 3 months, 6 months down the line, whatever, a year down the line for some people, depending what you're trying to do, you'll see that law of diminishing returns, and the honeymoon period is essentially over. So to answer your question, I think it's really difficult when people are experimenting with lots of different things. And there's plenty of neurotropics that seem to work really, really well. I've experimented with methylene blue, which just seems to do a couple of interesting things. And I think if you look at what a compound does, you say methylene blue compared to serotonin, for example, is methylene blue restores oxidative metabolism in the cell, whereas serotonin tends to when we look at kind of sleep, as we enter like sleep and it becomes a deeper sleep, we start to produce melatonin's been produced. There's serotonin's used to take us out of sleep, but also cortisol starts to rise at 2 a.m. as well. And so you start to get an increasing, not just in cortisol, but in serotonin that brings you out of your deep sleep state. So I think you have to look at it as a function. What do these compounds tend to do in isolation, which is really hard to look at, and what do these compounds do when they're in excess? And what are their relationships with other compounds within the body? So yeah, I think it's really hard to answer that question, especially when there are so many variables. If we're looking at a case by case, it will be easier to make that some assumptions based on that.
Okay. And so for someone listening to this who's a lay person, they don't have all of this background knowledge, but they are perhaps taking a nootropic or a 5-HTP or any of those mood enhancing supplements, or they have some sort of mood disorder or digestive disorder, what would be symptoms that they might not expect that would be relevant and that would be telltale signs that they already have excess serotonin? What are the things to look for?
Yeah, I always kind of look at, when I'm working with people, I look at kind of 5 or 6 key aspects of whether something's working for them. And that's, what's your energy like? What's your sleep like? What's your digestion, libido like? What's your, did I say energy?
Yep.
So energy, sleep, libido, mood. There's another one there, I can't remember, and pain. And I think the digestion one is probably one of the most important because of the role of serotonin within the bowel. So serotonin will regulate smooth muscle tissue within the colon. So you can be constipated with that in certain areas. You can have very, very loose, irritable bowels. So you might have constipation, you might have irritable, more very, very loose stools and going to the toilet multiple times a day, or you might be constipated and missing the toilet every couple of days. Sometimes I've got a theory with a lot of clients that I've worked with who've kind of been in a subclinical hypothyroid state for some period of time, is that they've got very low motility. Now, as we know with thyroid hormone, one of the key symptoms of hypothyroidism is low motility and constipation, because thyroid creates energy which will allow smooth muscle tissue to move the bowel by peristaltic reflex, and serotonin is used in that to a degree. But being constipated will usually be a sign of a low energy or a low thyroid state. If that keeps going on, we might see some damage going on in the bowel. So we might see a lot of endotoxin, which is the compound, the lipopolysaccharide that can damage the bowel, make it more permeable, make it more leaky. And sometimes that constipation, because there's a lot more compounds being around, might induce more serotonin because there's a lot more metabolites in the bowel. A lot of poorly digested foods, perhaps, that will create that irritation that will then go on to lead to irritable bowels and very loose bowels. So I often find that a lot of clients who've been in this kind of low energy state were constipated for some time, and then all of a sudden they're now having this really irritated bowel, which I think is just an artifact of ongoing irritation that hasn't been resolved. And the bowel can only take so much of it. They only take so much of being constipated or being exposed to lots of compounds that might damage it further.
Okay.
Oh, so yeah, the digestive system is one, obviously. I think the mood states as well is one, perhaps irritability, even it might be very different between each person and what kind of other hormones they might be producing, and the external stresses that might be involved with that as well. So mood, which might translate as irritability. I've certainly seen people with irritated bowels have irritated mood, which is quite a nice factor that you see, maybe a globally irritated state. You can also see the kind of the passiveness. One thing that serotonin is also used in is when energy becomes low and we see kind of coldness and low energy, particularly in hibernatory states, serotonin is increased as well. So I would say the kind of the mood that's involved with kind of withdrawal or kind of moving away from stimulus such as social interaction might be a part of that as well. And then there's always the sleep-wake cycles, having trouble get to sleep, not waking up effectively, waking up at key times, 2, 3, 4 in the morning because we have a lot of intestinal inflammation going on. I think the sleep, the mood, the energy, and the digestion are key factors that might be involved with having too much serotonin.
Yeah, so two things. Motility, gut motility. What is what would you say is sort of an average or an ideal amount of bowel movements in a day? And that's something that I think people have no real, in terms of what people I've spoken to, they've got no real sense of what is normal or what is abnormal. Is there a rough?
Yeah, I think you've got to be going for a minimum of once a day. That's the bare minimum. I mean, some doctors won't even suggest constipation unless you haven't gone for 3 days. But I think, look, if you look at what's going on within the bowel, depending on the type of meal, the idea is you draw your nutrients out. There's a number of other compounds that have to be evacuated. The longer you have that sitting in the bowel, the more damage is going to occur. The more you readily absorb I use the word toxins, but they are kind of toxins that need to be evacuated out the bowel. And when it doesn't, it sits there. And we produce compounds that are basically going to remove hormones and other kind of metabolites and toxins that will go back into the bloodstream to be detoxified, back up to the liver to be processed again. And maybe they'll be passed out in urine. But the stool has a number of kind of nasty things in it that want to be gotten rid of. So if you're not getting rid of that on a daily basis, that's going to cause problems. It's going to have an estrogenic-like action. We are going to see all these things that happen related to the damage that might occur in the bowel as well. So I think a bare minimum. There's even a suggestion that for each meal that you have, you should have a bowel movement. Now, many people don't have that. I think 2 or 3 times a day would be perfect. But I think the bare minimum people should strive for is once a day. I mean, I've had clients once every 2 weeks is the record. I know a friend in the UK who was working with a client. She had one every 28 days. There's a definition of being full of crap, right? I mean, but you see these kind of mood states in people. I mean, when I had the height of my thyroid issue, sometimes I was going to poop once every 4 days, and you just feel just like bloated and rubbish and worn down because there's all this stuff there that's just not being digested effectively. Okay. So yeah, I think once a day.
Yeah, and the other thing was back to the mood. Could we maybe talk quickly a bit about learned helplessness, what that is, what that looks like? How would someone recognize that, or could they realistically recognize it in themselves?
Well, I'll draw back to the basic rat physiology, which is where Hans Selye did a number of his experiments. I think it was actually the person that looked at the kind of the learned helplessness and stress, and it's like, when rats were put in a tank that had no escape exit, they would swim for hours and hours and hours and ultimately just go into decline because there was just no help. Rats that were up for a branch or something to climb out would then go back into the tank and they'd swim for a lot longer because they realized that there was a chance for getting out. And I think the concept of learned helplessness, when there's excesses of serotonin, I think environmental pollutants can also contribute to this state because there's a certain amount of disorganization of metabolism, disorganization of neural structures. We can see a lot of functions that are lost. And when you can't think right and when you can't produce energy effectively, you'll produce a lot of compounds that will kind of necessitate this kind of inefficiency. And it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle from a physiological state to a psychological state. And so when there's no chance for someone to weigh up whether there's a possibility of changing their situation, then everything just gets on top of them. And where, for some person, it might be, I don't know, losing something small or missing an appointment, and that kind of stimulus becomes such a big stressor for them. They just don't know where to go with it. And I think that the concept of it is just really just not having a way out, either physiologically or psychologically, and that's where kind of there can be many different therapies that might work really well for a bunch of people. But it's interesting to draw back to the original studies of serotonin, where there's quite a lot of research that shows that a lot of people were becoming suicidal, and they found within some of the modern SSRIs as well that they don't want to give them to younger people because it does start to create suicidal thoughts. Now, as far as side effects go, I think that's probably one of the worst side effects that you can get. Okay, coming out in a rash might be not that very nice, but kind of wanting to end life or having the thoughts of that. And I think that is part of the learned helplessness that one might infer that maybe an excess of serotonin might be doing on some level to to either a large or a kind of smaller cohort of people. It's really difficult to say.
Yeah.
It's easy to get into a conspiracy theorist type of thinking when you see a lot of the data that does get suppressed from some of these clinical trials. I don't know if you've ever read the book by Joseph Dummett, which is Drugs for Life. It's a really, really interesting book about how drugs are formulated, how the trials are done, how they're paid for, which is all really done to create profit. And he said a lot of these trials, they show when somebody should go on them. They create a concept of normality by taking them. But doctors never get asked the ability to ask the question, when is it appropriate for my client or patient to come off this drug? What are the effects of them coming off this drug? What's going to happen? And those questions, because those trials, the after trials that are done from the original trials, are never done. And even the marketing that's done on SSRIs, it's like, you know, that they'll have a graph and it shows it's great that you're up here right now, but to stay on that kind of even keel, and just because you feel great means you have to keep taking your drugs for a long period of time. There's never any kind of effort to make people feel that they can come off these drugs because they're causing a problem. And I think that's a definition of learned helplessness from a cultural or medical paradigm, is that there isn't any helping hands for people to come off these kind of drugs that could be problematic for life. I think this is, I'm not sure how, I remember reading a story, or somebody told it to me, about a doctor who was giving his wife, maybe she got upset at one point in the future, but for 20 years, he'd be basically putting a sedative or antidepressant in her tea for 20 years. And then he died. And then within a couple of months later, she had committed suicide because she wasn't getting her drugs that he'd been obviously putting into her tea every morning. And so there are obviously lots of aspects. I don't know how true that story is. I remember somebody telling me once. So I imagine there may be some situation out there where somebody's been doing that for sure. But I think that it's important to look at, again, what are the actions of these drugs and what do they actually do. And there is a lot of research that shows that they have these negative side effects related to mood. It also reminds me of another study. It was a statistics study that showed that that pharmaceutical drugs were trying to take credit for the amount of antidepressants that were being prescribed and how little suicides there were. But actually, when the other statisticians looked at it, they showed that it was actually really related to the economy. So when the economy was up, this was in the States, and there was kind of boom time, obviously people were a lot happier. Then there were people tending to kill themselves a lot more when obviously businesses were going bust. There was economic depression. And that was a time when more SSRIs were actually starting to be prescribed during states of depression. So it's interesting that, you know, everyone somewhere will be trying to take credit for the role of what these drugs are doing, but it's not always the case. There are many other kind of influences beyond the physiological, the biochemical. There will be kind of cultural and social and economic factors that contribute to these states.
Okay. So, again, for someone who's listening to this, someone who's interested in delving deeper, what are some practical, realistic things a person could do if they have a lot of these symptoms and they're thinking they want to work on reducing their excess serotonin?
Well, I think first of all, it's really important to me to add that, you know, I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose.
Yeah,
a lot of I'm saying are really kind of self-exploratory. And I'm certainly not saying to anybody now, hey, you're on SSRIs, you need to come off it, because that's not something I'm recommending at all. But I think there is a lot that can be done. If we look at the role of kind of mood states, whether it's depressive-like states, whether it's kind of feelings of helplessness and, you know, increasingly desperate behavior, there are many things from an organizational perspective that we know that are associated with kind of getting rid of these states. For example, depression. One of the most well-known symptoms of hypothyroidism is depression. Why? Because you don't produce enough energy. The brain doesn't get enough energy. We might get cold hands and cold feet, altered digestion. There's a lot of factors that we can look at from a mood state that suggest that our energetics might be off. Now we can acquire this kind of this feature of metabolism and biology from parents, but there's no reason why we can't grow out of it. And the environment might be a very, you talk about learned helplessness and not seeing a way out. Understanding what your environment is doing from either a building or a catabolic or breaking down process, I think, is very important. Living in a high pollution area might be driving these states, for example. Eating diets that don't allow you to produce optimal amounts of energy might be a factor that you need to look at. So I would always kind of still go back to those kind of basic things. What's your mood like? What's your energy like? What's your digestion like? Your sleep, your libido, how much pain are you exposed to? These are the questions of that might tie in nicely of whether maybe you do have an excess of serotonin. Maybe the foods that you're eating are driving you to have too much serotonin being produced in the bowel. And remember that if you're eating diets that are quite high in meat, like large amounts of meat, you're often getting an excess of tryptophan. When there's more inflammation in the bowel, you'll actually convert more serotonin from tryptophan, which will drive the inflammatory state. So eating protein is very important, but sometimes when you're not getting enough of the anti-inflammatory aminos like lysine, glycine, and proline, which are not only just kind of facilitate antioxidants, they promote the conversion to glutathione, which is the body's most important antioxidant. And antioxidant status is going to be very instrumental in kind of how much inflammation that we're producing. And we know that mood states might be a product of inflammation. And we look at the neurodegenerative issues such as in Alzheimer's or dementia. We know that there are issues with how the brain regulates sugar production. So again, all of these factors can tie in with an aspect of biology. So I think first thing to do is understanding your environment and what's in your environment that might be breaking you down. If we look at pollution, fine particulate matter might be an issue. If you're living near polluted areas, I think if you're at home, having an air filter in your home is very important. I'm in Dubai, and obviously the air is not as good quality as it could be compared to other parts of the world. So we have AC on, but we have air filters in the house as well that try and clean the air a bit more as well. Living near kind of busy roads might be an issue and something you want to kind of consider. Sometimes that's not always possible for people to move to different areas due to their job or their means. And I think having your house as much as a cocoon that can facilitate healing is something that's going to be important for an individual. So environment is one. Sleep, explore if you're having trouble getting to sleep, or if you're having trouble because you're waking up on a regular basis. Consider that serotonin and histamine are part of the process that are stopping you get to sleep or stopping you maintaining deep sleep where the deep restorative sleep takes place. If you look at kind of aspects of kind of the tone during the sleep, there's a light tone on the onset of latency in the non-REM sleep, but the REM portion of the sleep, the rapid eye movement, there's usually total inhibition of muscle tone. And it's totally lost. I guess apart from some of the flicking that goes on around the eyes and what's on there. So those kind of high serotonin states can kind of create this kind of issues with stress around feeling fatigued and not letting you get to sleep properly as well, and kind of feeling tight and uptight from the excess of serotonin, perhaps histamine as well. So consider what's in your diet. So I think having bone broth every day or gelatin every day is helpful for that. Avoid having just high protein meals on their own all the time. That's particularly useful. Having foods that allow your blood sugar to kind of lower some of the issues related to kind of, the low energy states can be useful at that. So it might go some way to offsetting that. If you have a diet that doesn't have enough available energy and you have a diet that's quite high in serotonin, maybe improving the available energy might help that, but ultimately removing some of the foods. So there's a lot of foods that contain serotonin or the precursor, the tryptophan. So bananas are one. In fact, there's a bunch of foods that you can see: pineapple, tomatoes, nuts, especially black walnuts, and lots of other foods. Remember, seeds, because they act like an agent, they irritate the digestive tract. Eating lots of kind of fruits or vegetables with seeds in is nature's way of saying, hey, have the fruit, but the seeds need to be pooped out the back end so you can distribute them everywhere. Though that's not the case much unless you're an animal these days. So I think kind of lowering the nuts and seeds is going to be very useful. I've got a list of foods in my program I can mail to you that you can put up on high foods with tryptophan. Sometimes dairy can be a problem for people because it's quite high in tryptophan, but I still think dairy and adequate calcium levels are very, very important. So I'd rather have dairy in, and sometimes if people are having issue with dairy within the diet, adding some gelatin or kind of bone broth to your diet can help to lessen the effect of tryptophan. But actually, milk is actually really useful for sleep anyway, because it has analogues of GABA in that help you get into sleep quicker. So don't always shoot the messenger with dairy. Turkey has the highest amount of tryptophan. So Christmas is enjoy Christmas, but try not to have turkey all year round. That might be a useful suggestion. But not eating just muscle meats all the time. Getting the bone broth and gelatin and eating skin and products can be very helpful to lowering the effects of serotonin, or certainly the excess of tryptophan that will convert to serotonin. That can be useful. I think they're probably the main things for lowering serotonin. I think you've got to kind of look at all of these things, kind of mood, digestion, sleep, energy, as being a marker of that. Of course, that in isolation isn't going to be just the issue all the time. So it might be something totally different. It might be blood sugar levels, might be low thyroid, might be pollution. They might synergize with aspects of serotonin. So I think there's a lot of things that you can look at when you get your digestion, your sleep, your energy, libido, all these kind of things sorted out. These will generally improve and take you to a lower serotonin state anyway.
Okay. And is carrot salad, raw carrot, one of the useful things you would tend to use?
Yeah, I think, that either the kind of the raw carrot salad, boiled mushrooms, even activated charcoal can lower some of the metabolites that are found in the bowel. I think the carrot salad is a genius way of just getting people to lower their intestinal inflammation and kind of de-estrogenize the bowel, as a phrase to use. So I with all my clients, if my clients come to me with either digestive inflammation or constipation, they're having really loose stools as well, the carrot salad, along with modulating what foods create energy, are easily digestible, I haven't seen anyone not respond within the space of 2 weeks where they've got optimal bowel function for most people. So that carrot salad is a win-win situation. Yeah. I think the boiled button mushrooms for lowering kind of aromatase in the body is useful as well. So if you boil white button mushrooms up for 2 to 3 hours, it removes the liver toxins that you find in mushrooms. If you're having issues with kind of high estrogen, which will synergize with serotonin, then it acts as like an aromatase inhibitor. So people that have a little bit more adipose tissue will generally convert testosterone, progesterone into estrogen, which can be problematic and drive these high estrogen states. And I think having the mushrooms is very, very useful and does a similar job too.
Yeah. And the carrot salad, is that like a daily, once daily, twice daily? Is there?
I think once a day is fine. And you might get bored with it. You might swap that with the mushrooms or the bamboo shoots, which is particularly useful. You get, even I got, I'd do the carrot salad for a month, and you are sick of carrots by the end of the month. So I think coming back cyclically and doing it again is really useful for a lot of people, for sure.
Okay, well, I think that's a fairly comprehensive and practical look at serotonin. Do you have any closing thoughts? Obviously you have your online programs, and so I've been talking to a few of my clients a bit more about this kind of thing, because it seems like what they need is more nutritional than hands-on therapy. So could you do a quick shout out for your services?
Sure. Well, I have an online coaching program, which is there's either like a platinum program, which is working with me one-on-one over 10 weeks, or there's like an initial consultation, and then you're left exposed to all the coaching information. There's videos on how to self-assess and work your way through. Or there's just a basic one where you get access to all the information, videos, online platform on Facebook, which is a closed group. So I work with clients around the world in resolving these issues, from hormone to digestion issues, sleep kind of stuff. So yeah, thanks for letting me mention that.
Oh, no problem.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, so, and you're on Instagram, you're on Facebook.
Yeah,
I'll include the
I
links.
get a bit sick to death of social media, but Tomo Littlewood on Instagram and Balanced Body Mind on Facebook. There's quite a lot of posts on this kind of stuff, and I'll probably be taking a little bit of not doing so much on there at the moment because I'm halfway through my masters, so it's challenging.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, so that's great. I'll include all those links. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Keith. And,
pleasure as always.
We'll have to think of a topic for the next one.
Yeah, there's always plenty to talk about, right?
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks.
Right,
I'll
buddy.
be in touch when this is ready to go. Have a good day.
Good to speak to you. Chat again soon, Paul. Take care, buddy.
See you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.